Today I'm creating a simple shaker window to use as a background for my floral focal point. Hello there, Michelle Short here with Terrific Tags with Michelle. I'm here on the Altenew YouTube channel on the first and third Saturday of the month. So if you enjoy my videos, I'd love for you to subscribe. So let's get started. For my floral focal point, I'm using the Cute Open Rose die set today. And I'm going to cut this from some classic Crest 110 solar white cardstock. This set has just the one flower, and I'm going to cut it twice so that I have two flowers. There are 4 layers for the petals, 2 layers for the flower centres, and then 2 different types of leaves. So I'm holding those dies down with some low tack tape, and then I can run that through my die cutting machine to cut those out. I can then remove the dies from the cardstock and pop out all of those die cuts. Like I said, I do want to do this twice so that I have 2 flowers. I can then grab my perfect picker, and I like to use this to remove those centres of the petals. This is that keyhole system, which is going to help line everything up. And I also like to use that perfect picker just to go around the outside edges of some of these die cuts. It helps to remove some of those little cardstock hairs that tend to hang around after die cutting. So I can just remove those pieces from the flower centres as well. I have then placed all of my die cuts on my sticky mat. That's going to hold them in place while I do my ink blending on top. I'm starting off with the petals, and I'm using the Enchanted Garden Fresh dye ink collection, the 3 lightest shades, and I'm using a mini blending brush. I want these flowers to be quite light and airy. I'm going for like a really light and airy feel to my card today. And so I wanted the flowers to be quite light as well. And I happen to really love purples, so I'm going to go with purples today. So I'm starting off with the lightest shade. And I want the ink blending to kind of fade out to the white of the cardstock on the edges of the petals. And so this colour here that I'm adding on first is going to kind of be a little bit of a transition colour. So as I add the ink to the centre of these petals, as there's less ink on the brush, it's automatically going to get lighter as it goes to the edges of those petals. So it's just going to fade out to the white of the cardstock. I can then go in with the second lightest shade and again do the exact same thing, but I'm not bringing the colour as far to the edges of the petals as I did with the lightest shade. So just focusing that colour in the centre of these petals. Now these inks do tend to dry a little bit lighter than when they go on, and so I am quite aware of that. So I think I quite like the intensity of the colour at this point, but it is going to dry a little bit lighter. So I'm going to go in with the next darkest shade and just add a little bit of this into those flower centres. And then when this ink dries, it is going to dry a little bit lighter. But I do really like having that intensity of colour in the centre of these petals. So just going in and adding that into all of these petals here. I can then move on to the leaves, and I'm using the Green Valley Fresh dye ink collection. And I'm using a micro blending brush for these ones just because the leaves are so tiny. If I went in with a larger brush, I would end up covering most of the leaves with the darkest shade, which I didn't really want to do. So I'm going in with the Firefly, which is the lightest shade, and just covering these leaves. I am again still making the kind of tips of the leaves a little bit lighter. I can then go in with the next darkest shade, just adding that towards the bottom, and then I'm finishing off with Shadow Creek. And to be honest, most of this colour is going to get covered up because I'm going to pop the leaves behind the flowers, but it is quite nice just to have that gradient. And then for the flower centres, I'm using the Summer Afternoon Fresh dye ink collection and just the 2 lightest shades. So starting off with the lightest one, I'm adding that onto the top layer of the flower centre. And then I can use the Warm Sunshine for the bottom layer. And the piece that has that keyhole system in, you're not going to see that, but I do just like to add the ink blending onto it, just in case I don't line everything up perfectly. You're not going to see the white of the cardstock underneath. So I did set those aside to dry for a few minutes, and now I can start assembling my flowers. So you can see in the center is that keyhole there, and that's going to help us line up these layers. So I'm adding a little bit of liquid glue around where that keyhole is, and that is enough glue to hold this in place as long as you've got a nice strong glue. And then I can line up those keyholes, and I like to use tweezers for this. This helps so that I can kind of hover it on top, see where I want to place it down before I actually place it down. If I'm concerned that I've got too much glue, I can just dab that off onto my scrap piece of paper here. And I find it quite helpful to add that white scrap paper behind where the keyhole is, so I can see it a little bit better from where I am. And then I can just lift that up. I tend to hold it up a little bit, it's a little bit easier for me to see. And then I can finish off with the flower center. So just adding some liquid glue onto the back of this, just dabbing the excess off, and then I can pop that on top. And if you don't line these up perfectly, I still think they look really pretty, but that keyhole just helps you to know where everything's supposed to be placed. And then I can cover up that keyhole with that layer, and then I can go in with the top layer. And these flowers are just so cute, I really love them. Really very pretty, but really quite nice and small as well, so works for lots of different designs. So now I'm going to work on the shaker portion, and this is the Mini Delight Fabulous Flowers set. So you get a stamp set and then also a die set. And I'm going to use this arch here to create my shaker window. My series is Terrific Tags with Michelle. Now technically this isn't a tag, but I'm kind of having it as if it was a tag. To me it's the shape of a tag, so I am cheating slightly, but I really wanted to use this shape, so I hope you'll forgive me. But when I cut this out, you'll see that the kind of what would be the positive part of the die actually really does look like a tag, so that's how I'm going with it. I'm placing this towards the center of the top part of my cardstock panel here, and this is cut to 4 1/4 inches by 5 1/2 inches, and I'm using my T-square ruler here just to make sure that that is placed down straight. I can hold that down with some low tack tape, and then I can run that through my die cutting machine. So I can pop that out. I'm just figuring out which is the easiest way to pop that through. So this is the piece that I'm going to be using today. But as you can see, this piece here is just the perfect size for a tag. I can just cut a little hole at the top there, and that will work perfectly as a tag. So I can use that for a future project. For now, I'm just using the window frame. So I have placed that down onto an A2 size white card base, and with a pencil I'm just drawing a very faint line around the edge of that window. That's so that I know where I need to place my sequins. I have turned this panel over and I can add some adhesive onto the back. I personally prefer to add acetate with some sort of dry adhesive rather than wet adhesive. That is personal preference. I just find that sometimes wet adhesive or liquid adhesive, whatever you want to call it, slides around a little bit with acetate, so I tend to go for something like double-sided tape. So that's what I'm using here, and I'm just going around the outside of that arch window, just adding bits of that tape there. Then I can remove the backings, and I like to do this with tweezers. It just helps me out a little bit to lift that backing off. And then I can grab my acetate, and I've cut that down to size, and then I can place that over the window, just making sure that that's really well stuck down. And then I'm just going to grab a Swiffer cloth just to make sure that I don't have any fingerprints or anything like that on the acetate. I can then go in with some instant dimension foam tape. This is the 1 inch size. And ideally, when I'm adding foam tape onto the back of a panel, if I'm cutting it down, I like to have the cut side on the inside, so that if anyone looks from the kind of side of the card, you're not going to see my cut line that might not be completely straight. You're going to see the edge of the foam tape, how it's been cut. So that's how I personally like to do it. So I'm just going to go around the outside edges here with that foam tape. Ideally, I also like to not cut my foam tape into pieces and just have one long piece, because again, I think it looks a little bit nicer on the outside edges, but I also don't want to waste my foam tape, so I try and do a little bit of both, try and have less cuts as possible. It didn't really work out so well on this card, but I don't want to waste that foam tape, like I say. So I've removed the backings off of the foam tape of this piece because I want to bend it around the top of that arch, and it's a lot easier when the backings are off of that foam tape. So I've cut that in a kind of diagonal at the end, and then I can manipulate that tape round into the shape of the arch, and then I can just cut off the other side. I want to make sure that this foam tape is really butting up against each other so that none of my sequins are going to fall out. And then I also just want to make sure that I'm covering the rest of that panel to make sure that it's well supported with that foam tape. Ordinarily with a shaker, I tend to go around the outside edges of the foam tape and then also on the acetate with an anti-static powder tool. That helps to remove static and then also helps that the sequins don't accidentally stick to that foam tape. However, in this instance, I would quite like it actually if some of the sequins kind of attach to the acetate. It's just going to help with my personal design, but I did want to show you what I would usually do. So I'm now going to bring in my sequins. These aren't the ones that I'm actually using today, but I wanted to show you how they are packaged. You get 6 different sizes and each size is in its own little bag, which is really helpful. So if you want to keep them in the different sizes, you can keep them in the little bags and just use them from the little bags, and you can see that they range from tiny little sequins to larger ones there at the bottom. But for me, for my storage purposes, I have put them all into one tub, and that seems to work quite nicely for me. So I'm using the clear iridescent sequins today, and I'm going to place my sequins inside of where I drew that faint pencil line of the arch. There are lots of different ways that you can create shaker cards. You can add the sequins into the window, like inside of the foam tape on the piece that I've already done, or you can add them to your card base and then add the window on top. That is my personal preferred method. I find it a little bit more difficult to add the card base upside down rather than adding a window the correct way up onto a card base, so I'm hoping that kind of makes sense. The downside of doing it in this way is that it's quite difficult to see how many sequins you actually need, which is why I drew that line, so that not only can I see where I want to place them, I can kind of also see where I'm kind of fiddling around here to try and move them to the shape that it is, so I can kind of see how many I might need. Now obviously bear in mind that when you lift the card up, if they're all going to kind of go to the bottom of this piece, then you are going to lose some of that look, which is why I kind of wanted some of them to sort of stick a little bit to that acetate. I'm then just going to erase those pencil lines of that arch. To be honest with you, I probably could have left them in. They were so faint you wouldn't have seen them, but I'm just trying to remove them and then also make sure I remove all of that eraser dust as well. So now I can remove the backings off of the foam tape of this panel here, and I'm going to add a little bit of glue stick adhesive onto the foam tape. I want something that's going to give me a little bit of wiggle room so that if I don't place this down perfectly, I've got time to wiggle it in place. You can definitely do this with liquid glue as well, but I find that that glue stick kind of slides a little bit easier, and so that's why I went with that today. So I can place this over my card base, and I apologize that my head gets a little bit in the way here, but I want to try and line it up as best as possible. So I'm just kind of placing it down very lightly to start with, wiggling my head around to see if it's placed where I want it to, and then once I'm happy, I can press that down. So just making sure that that foam tape is really well stuck down, and then I can give it a shake. And I probably could have done with a few more sequins in here, but I did want it to be fairly subtle. I'm using this shaker more as kind of like a background to add a little bit of sparkle onto my card rather than like a full-on shaker. That's why I went with kind of white on white, but you could definitely go in and add some ink blending onto that card base before you add the sequins on top. That way that they would show up a little bit more. It would also add a little bit more colour onto the card, or you could use sequins that are a different colour, like the gold ones or something like that. But I was going for more of a kind of subtle look today. So I have manipulated those flower petals a little bit with my fingers just to make sure that they're not so flat. And now I can work out the placement of these flowers and leaves. So I can grab the leaves, kind of pop them behind the flowers. And I like to do this before I stick anything down. I've got time to wiggle things in place or move things completely if I really need to. And then I think my last leaf will go down here. So I'm pretty happy with that placement. So now I can add some adhesive onto the back of these leaves. And like I say, I tend not to like to add liquid adhesive here. So I'm going in with glue tape and adding that towards the base of these leaves, because that's what's going to stick down onto the acetate. And that's is going to dry fairly quickly, but the great thing about this glue tape is that you do have time to lift it up and move things around if you need to, and then once it kind of adheres together, it does adhere really quite nicely. So I can just pop this leaf there, and then I can just go around all of the other ones. I left the one at the bottom for some reason. I think I decided I wasn't 100% certain where I wanted it to go until I placed down the flowers. I wasn't sure how I was going to adhere the flowers. I wasn't sure if I was going to use some foam tape or I was just going to adhere them down flat. In the end, I thought that I would add some foam tape to these just for a little bit more dimension on the card. It is pretty clean and simple, so it's quite nice to have that extra dimension. Now I can stick that leaf down underneath, and then add a small amount of the Instant Dimension foam tape onto the back of this flower. And then I can pop that down. And I just like to use tweezers here for the placement, so I can hover them in place before I stick anything down. And then I have stamped and heat embossed a sentiment from the Mini Delight Fabulous Flowers stamp set. I have heat embossed that onto Crafty Necessities jet black cardstock and cut that down into a strip. And I've adhered that down with a little bit more Instant Dimension foam tape. So just making sure everything's well stuck down. And that is the card finished for today. I really love that kind of subtle shaker in the background. It definitely does shake quite nicely, but I also like that some of those sequins are kind of stayed in place, and I think it just adds a really nice sparkle onto the background of that focal point. Links to the products that I used will be listed in the description bar on YouTube and also over on the Altenew blog. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Hello there, did that video just spark your creativity? And do you want more project ideas and inspiration videos too? Well, if you do, please make sure that you subscribe to the Altenew YouTube channel. Also, make sure that you do click that notification bell so you don't miss a video. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.